So you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all of the abstract math that we've been doing, but it is important to recognize that understanding the basics about energy is important in many real-world applications. So you've probably heard a lot about combustion of hydrocarbons, or perhaps you've heard about fossil fuels. So hydrocarbons are compounds that are composed only of carbon and hydrogen. So a good example would be CH4, C2H6, C3H8. These are all hydrocarbons because they only contain the elements carbon and hydrogen. Now, the interesting thing about hydrocarbons is when they undergo the chemical reaction called combustion, which means when they are reacted with oxygen, they all form two products. They form gaseous water, which is steam, and gaseous carbon dioxide, which is an odorless, colorless gas. But in addition to these two compounds, they also produce copious amounts of energy in the form of heat and light. So a good example of this is the combustion of methane, which is often referred to as natural gas. It's the type of gas that you might burn at home if you have gas at home. So methane, 1 unit of methane reacts with 2 units of oxygen gas to produce 1 unit of CO2 gas and 2 units of gaseous water, steam, and a whole bunch of heat. Now, because hydrocarbons all undergo this kind of energy producing reaction, they're often used as fuels, and they're often used as, or more correctly, what we might call energy sources. So good examples of hydrocarbons that are used as fuels include things like biomass. So this would be like, a good example of that would be like just wood, but then there are also a whole class of other fuels which you've probably heard a lot about. They're called fossil fuels, and so these are hydrocarbons that are formed from organisms that have been decomposing and being chemically modified over often millions of years. So the three most common fossil fuels are oil, coal, and gas. So fossil fuels are classified as a non-renewable energy source, and the reason why they are considered non-renewable is that the rate at which we use them is far quicker than the rate at which they are being produced. So we're consuming, fossil fuels. We're probably going to use all the fossil fuels we have up, within less than 1,000 years, say. But it took millions of years to produce those fossil fuels, so they're going to run out, right? Because it takes a lot longer to make it than what it does to use it. So it's kind of like, your paycheck. If you're spending money faster than you're earning it, then you're going to end up in debt. So for that reason, fossil fuels are classified as non-renewable energy sources. You've probably heard about a little bit about the nuclear fuel cycle, and the nuclear energy cycle is based on a process called nuclear fission. Fission means breaking apart. So this is also a term used in biology. If we have a cell and it breaks into two cells, then it is undergoing what we call fission. Okay, so there's a cell breaking into two cells. That would be called binary fission because it's breaking into two. So in a nuclear reactor, we're conducting nuclear fission, normally of uranium. So we're breaking uranium atoms into multiple fragments. This is done in a hopefully controlled manner inside a nuclear reactor. Now, nuclear fission is also a non-renewable energy source because there's only a certain amount of these nuclear fuels on our planet, and once we use them up, they're gone. So at the current rate of use, we have about 60 to 100 years remaining of uranium. So if we were to radically, accelerate the use of uranium, it would run out within a couple of decades, theoretically. So if we were to increase production of energy using uranium fission, say threefold, we could be done with all of our sources of uranium in as little as 20 years. So it's one of the reasons why there's not so much interest in building very large numbers of nuclear reactors. The other reason why people are moving away from non-renewable energy sources is just due to costs. So if we look at some of the costs of things like nuclear energy or some of the fossil fuels, they're actually quite pricey. This is data from the 10th of January of 2021. So if we compare something to a nuclear price per megawatt hour, it's what it's called, and we compare that to something like wind, you can see that it's very, very, very expensive, and so there's a lot more enthusiasm for wind than what there is for nuclear energy in the current market. Similar for a lot of these other things, like some forms of gas-powered power stations are almost as expensive as nuclear power. So when we look at the renewables, what do we see? We see things like wind, geothermal, and solar are, cheaper or incomparable in cost to conventional energy sources. But of course, they have the advantage of, they're completely renewable. They're going to be around forever. They're not going to be running out in, a couple of decades or a couple of 100 years. All right, so one of the other advantages of some of these renewable sources of energy is, unlike burning hydrocarbons, there's no emission of carbon dioxide. So so these things have sort of, this discussion of energy has very real world consequences. You can learn more about this if you go to this website here, which is just an investment company, and they'll give you prices on all of these things. Okay, now you'll often hear a lot of talk about energy in your biology classes as well. So many biological processes and indeed many biological organisms are classified according to how they, the energy source used to drive that process, or the principal energy source of that organism. So for example, you probably know that plants all have in common that they conduct photosynthesis, which is the conversion of simple molecules like carbon dioxide into complex molecules like sugars by using sunlight as an energy source. So if an organism is said to, be photosynthetic, we understand that it's using primarily sunlight as its energy source to drive chemical processes. Not all organisms do this. Some organisms use what we call chemosynthesis to turn simple molecules into complex molecules. So chemosynthesis means that we're using a chemical reaction that releases energy in order to make this happen. So again, the organism can take in simple molecules, perhaps like carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, and through a series of chemical reactions turn that into more complicated things like proteins, DNAs, and so forth, right? The other biological process that kind of is very much concerned with energy is the process called cellular respiration. So in cellular respiration, what happens is that there's a whole series of reactions, but the key result is that chemical energy is used to take oxygen and other simple molecules, which we call nutrients, and turn it into a compound called ATP, which is a store of energy. Okay, so hopefully you get a feel after listening to this section that you're going to keep hearing about energy again and again and again, whether it be in your, in your personal life, as you hear discussions about current and future energy sources that we're going to use to power our world, or whether it be in your anatomy and physiology classes when we're talking about how organisms get the energy that they need to drive the processes that are required for them to function. Okay, so hopefully that was interesting, and once again, if you have any trouble with the content, please feel free to reach out to me.